The coliseum of Vor'Xan Prime burned with golden light, its towering obsidian pillars reaching into the sky. The air pulsed with electric tension as the combat arena shimmered beneath a planetary force field, an ethereal cage that would hold warriors until the battle was won. Kaelin Vor'Xan stood in the center of the training ground, her breathing ragged, her body aching. Around her, the High Council of War, adorned in ceremonial armor, watched with the cold amusement of men who had already decided she was unworthy. Across from her, the combat drone, a gleaming monstrosity of quantum steel and adaptive AI, recalibrated its stance. Again came the voice of General Kaeldrak, cold and absolute. Kaelin clenched her fists. She couldn't afford to fail again. The Coliseum fell silent. Then the laughter began. Murmurs of disappointment slithered through the crowd, the neural tendrils of the nobles flickering in silent conversation, their thoughts pressing against her mind. Unworthy. She is no heir to the Vor'Xan throne. Kaelin forced herself upright, her muscles trembling. Her father, Emperor Thalzan, sat upon his elevated throne, expression carved from stone. But she knew the truth. Behind those dark, unreadable eyes, he had already made his judgment. The general turned to the emperor, his battle-worn features unreadable. Your Majesty, it is time we face reality. The princess will never be strong enough to rule. Perhaps it is time to reconsider the succession. A whisper of agreement rippled through the assembled nobles. Kaelin's breath hitched. But before she could speak, her father raised a single hand, and the entire Coliseum fell silent. Then he stood, a giant of a man, armored in black void steel, his presence alone commanding absolute power. His gaze settled on her, unreadable, unshaken. You are weak, he said, his voice reverberating through the chamber like a death sentence. No more excuses. If you cannot learn from our finest instructor, perhaps it is time you learn from something far more primitive. Kaelin's chest tightened. What did he mean? Admiral Siros, the Emperor continued, shifting his gaze to the cybernetic officer beside him. Follow one of those creatures the Centaurian lords keep as status symbols. A human. Murmurs of shock rippled through the crowd. Even Kaelin stiffened in disbelief. The counselors exchanged glances, a mixture of amusement and disdain flickering across their alien features. The humans are resilient, Admiral Siros admitted, adjusting the neural interface embedded in his skull. Strange creatures. Despite their biological inferiority, they have demonstrated remarkable combat instincts. The Emperor's gaze remained locked on Kaelin. He said, his voice cold, Your final chance, daughter, is to learn from them. A sharp wave of laughter followed the declaration. Kaelin's hands curled into fists. Her father turned. The matter settled, the decision absolute. Kaelin stood there, feeling the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. Somewhere, across the void of space, a human was about to be dragged into this nightmare. For the first time in her life, Kaelin prayed to the gods of war that this creature was everything they feared. The chamber doors hissed open with a rush of pressurized air. Kaelin stood rigid, her neural tendrils twitching, watching as her so-called salvation was dragged into the purification field. The human floated inside the containment stasis, suspended in a shimmering energy field as the palace's decontamination process ran its course. Kaelin had read about their kind. A primitive, soft-skinned species with no natural armor, no reinforced bones, no bioelectric defenses. Their world was a cesspool of uncontrolled evolution, ruled more by chaos than order. Yet as she watched, something about this one unsettled her. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, muscled, but not in the engineered way of her people. There was something raw about it, something earned rather than designed. His skin was strangely pale under the harsh sterility of the chamber lights, the ragged scars on his knuckles and forearms telling silent stories of old battles. Then his eyes opened. They weren't the dull, placid gaze of a pet or a servant. They were sharp, scanning his surroundings. Admiral Siros adjusted the neural interface on his temple, consulting a datapad. Parker Cole, human male. Former operative of a Terran military faction called Special Forces. Kaelin frowned. You retrieved a soldier? Siros's cybernetic eye whirred as he processed more data. Not just a soldier, a survivor of something called Black Ops, covert warfare, close-quarters combat specialist. According to our intelligence, humans like him are uniquely conditioned for war. Kaylin crossed her arm, studying the way the human's fingers flexed inside the oversized quarantine suit he'd been forced into, conditioned for war. And yet his kind lacked natural weapons. No claws, no fangs, no venom. Then why did he look so damn calm? The decontamination field flickered, then vanished with a soft chime. Gravity returned to normal, and the human dropped to his feet, steady despite the sudden shift. The suit was far too large for him, sagging at the arms and legs like a child playing dress-up. Then he smirked. "Hell of a way to wake up," he muttered. The translator device pinned to Admiral Shiros's uniform converted his words into the formal speech of the Vor'Xan Empire, but Kaylin caught the tone underneath. Unshaken, wry amusement. Even. Did he not understand where he was? Who he was standing in front of? "You have been chosen as the royal companion to Princess Kaylin Vor'Xan," Shiros announced, his voice clipped and formal. "You will train her in the ways of human combat. You will serve the royal house." Parker yawned. Kaylin's neural tendrils stiffened in shock. Every noble in the palace chamber went still. Even Shiros's cybernetic eye paused mid-calculation, as if unable to comprehend what had just happened. A human, a mere creature, had dismissively yawned in the face of a royal decree. Kaylin stepped forward, half expecting the human to realize his error and fall to his knees in apology. Instead, he rolled his shoulders, testing the movement of his limbs, before shaking his head. "Yeah, see? That's going to be a problem," he said casually, glancing at Kaylin. "I don't do serving." The silence in the chamber became absolute. Kaylin stared at him, barely able to process the sheer audacity of his words. Her father's decree had been absolute. The High Council had decreed this human as her last chance. And he was rejecting it? She took a step closer, her golden irises narrowing. "You don't have a choice." Parker finally looked at her, really looked. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he chuckled. "I've been having difficulties, and I still walked out alive. You think I'm scared of some entitled alien with daddy issues?" Kaylin lunged. Her training kicked in instantly. She went for a precise, controlled strike, aiming to incapacitate, just enough to remind him of his place. Except he wasn't there. Before her mind could register what had happened, her arm was caught midair. In an instant, she was flipped. The world spinning before her back slammed into the training mat with a force that rattled her teeth. Stars flickered in her vision. The entire court gasped. She blinked. Parker was standing over her, utterly unfazed, his grip still firm on her wrist. "You fight like a tank," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "All power." No adaptability, no finesse. Kaylin's mind reeled. No one, not even the most elite instructors in the Empire, had ever moved like that against her. No one had ever flipped her so effortlessly. Parker released her arm and took a step back. Kaylin sprang to her feet. The council was whispering now, their neural tendrils flickering wildly, thoughts cascading through the chamber like a storm. The princess was bested by a human. Kaylin clenched her fists. She wanted to deny it, to claim it had been luck, but she knew the truth. Parker Cole wasn't just some primitive creature. He was something else entirely. And for the first time in her life, Kaylin felt something she had never expected to feel. Not anger, hope. The silence still hung thick in the air, the weight of Kaylin's humiliation pressing down on the chamber. She had never been bested so easily, never been dismissed so casually. And now, the whispers of the court slithered through her neural tendrils, each one laced with disbelief. She wanted to silence them, to prove that this was a fluke, a mistake. Instead, she turned to Parker, eyes burning with cold determination. Again. Parker raised an eyebrow. "You sure? You barely walked away from that last one." Her jaw tightened. Again. A flicker of something passed through his gaze, something sharper, something like respect. He rolled his shoulders. "All right, princess, let's dance." And so began the longest, most excruciating training of Kaylin's life. For weeks, Parker called her movements predictable, said her stances were too rigid, laughed when she tried to overpower him with brute force alone. "Your people fight like warships," he told her one night. After disarming her for the 5th time that hour, "You move forward. You fight at full power." Kaylin, breathless and furious, wiped blood from the corner of her mouth. "And what's wrong with that?" Parker smirked, stepping back just out of reach. "It works fine, Until you run into someone who doesn't play by your rules. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. That's your problem, princess. You've been playing by someone else's rules your whole life. Something in her chest tightened at those words. She shoved him off and rose, sweat-drenched and furious. Then teach me. He taught her how to flow, how to read an opponent's movements before they even made them. He taught her that sometimes the best move wasn't to strike harder, but to let the enemy's strength them. Kaelin hated him for it. Hated the way he moved so effortlessly, the way he made her feel slow, the way he always saw the openings before she did. But God's help her, she learned. For the first time, she adapted. She stopped relying on her sheer power and started thinking. Started waiting for Parker's counters instead of rushing in blindly. The first time she finally makes him fall instead of the other way around. For a moment, pure silence filled the training hall. Then Parker let out a breathless, almost impressed laugh. Huh. Kaelin, gasping, stared at him in shock. Parker sat up, rubbing his ribs. Well, took you long enough? And against all reason, against the crushing weight of expectation and failure and duty, Kaelin grinned. That night, Parker found her sitting on the palace balcony, gazing up at the twin moons. You did good today, he said, leaning against the railing. She didn't look at him. I barely won one round. Parker scoffed. And 3 weeks ago, you couldn't even land a hit. That's not just progress. Princess, that's a miracle. She turned to him then, her neural tendrils flickering in the wind. Do you really believe I can win the tournament? Parker didn't hesitate. I wouldn't be wasting my time if I didn't. Something shifted between them at that moment. Kaelin felt like maybe she wasn't fighting alone. The grand arena of Vor'Xan Prime pulsed with energy, its towering obsidian walls vibrating with the thunder of 1,000 voices. The air crackled with anticipation, charged by the presence of noble houses, high-ranking warriors, and the Emperor himself, all gathered to witness the culmination of the greatest combat tournament in the Empire. Kaelin stood at the heart of the coliseum, breathing in the moment, feeling the weight of expectation pressing down on her. This was it, her final test. Across from her, Silvara stepped onto the battlefield, her presence radiating superiority. The armor plating fused into her skin gleamed under the golden floodlights, her cybernetic enhancements humming with raw power. You don't belong here, Silvara sneered, her voice laced with contempt. You've spent your life hiding behind books and theories, while the rest of us were molded into warriors. She tilted her head, a smirk playing at her lips. You could have been something useful, if you weren't such a disappointment. Kaelin's neural tendrils twitched, but she didn't rise to the bait. Not this time. Not after everything Parker had taught her. The announcer's voice boomed, shaking the arena. Final match! Princess Kaelin Vor'Xan versus Lady Silvara of House Val'Shir. The starting chime echoed through the coliseum, and Silvara moved first. She was fast, inhumanly fast. Enhanced reflexes, kinetic boosters in her legs, a walking war machine. Kaelin barely dodged the first strike. The second attack followed. Kaelin ducked, rolled, and barely missed the third strike, but suddenly have an impact. The crowd roared, sensing Kaelin's disadvantage, but Kaelin wasn't here to play by their rules. She sidestepped, letting Silvara overextend herself. Then she moved in with precision. A feint to the left, a low sweep to the back of the knee. Silvara stumbled, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Kaelin surged forward, grabbing the cybernetic limb mid-recoil and twisting, using her opponent's own momentum against her. The arena gasped. Silvara recovered, her lips curling into a snarl. You think that's going to save you? She slammed her fist into the ground, activating a shockwave pulse. Kaelin was thrown back, skidding against the floor, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. Pain exploded through her ribs, but she pushed herself up. Silvara's enhancements glowed brighter, her power surging. Let's see if your little human tricks can handle this. Kaelin's breath hitched. She knew what was coming. From the spectator's balcony, Parker watched with clenched fists. His eyes darted to the arena sensors, the data feeds, watching Silvara's power levels spike. No, he muttered. That's not standard tech. His gaze flicked toward the Royal Council. The nobles sat still, expressionless. They had allowed this. Kaelin, Parker whispered under his breath. On the battlefield, Silvara charged. Kaelin reacted on instinct. She moved like water, dodging, redirecting, slipping past each attack by the slimmest of margins. But Silvara's speed was increasing. Her blows became a blur, her enhancements pushing her beyond natural limits. Then Kaelin saw it. The cybernetics glitching, a fraction of a second delay between her movements and her augmentations. Kaelin inhaled and steadied herself. Then she let Silvara attack with everything she had. The next strike came, a full-powered lunge, a blow that could end the match instantly. Kaelin sidestepped at the last possible moment, pivoting with the motion, and struck precisely where the cybernetic wiring met organic muscle. Silvara's body locked up, her enhancements overloading, glitching, failing. Her eyes went wide, realization dawning too late. Kaelin seized her by the arm, shifted her stance, and knocked down Silvara across the arena. The coliseum erupted into chaos. The announcer's voice cracked with disbelief. "Winner, Princess Kaelin Vor'Xan." The cheers were deafening, but Kaelin barely heard them. She turned to the royal throne, where her father sat still, expression unreadable. For a single, agonizing moment, she thought he would remain silent, that he would dismiss her victory. Then, slowly, he stood. The entire arena fell into stunned silence. Emperor Thalzan gazed down at her, and then, to her shock, he raised his neural tendrils in the warrior's salute. A recognition of her victory, a recognition of her strength. Kaelin felt her chest tighten. She had done it. Then the arena doors slammed open. A massive figure strode through the smoke-filled entrance, his presence sending a ripple of dread through the crowd. General Kaeldrak, the undefeated champion, the living war legend. His voice rumbled like a coming storm. "This tournament is not over," he declared, his gaze locking onto Kaelin. The air grew thick with tension. "By the ancient laws of the Empire," Kaeldrak continued, stepping onto the battlefield, "I challenge the victor to prove their worth. Here, now." The crowd roared. Kaelin's pulse thundered in her ears. Her limbs ached, but she forced herself to stand taller. She had just survived the most brutal fight of her life, and now she was being asked to do the impossible. Kaeldrak drew his weapon, the air humming with energy. Kaelin exhaled slowly. Then she stepped forward. "I accept." The crowd exploded in a frenzy of deafening cheers and gasps, their neural tendrils flickering with excitement and disbelief. The Princess of Vor'Xan, fresh from one of the hardest fights of her life, had just accepted the challenge of a living legend. Kaeldrak stepped forward, a titan of war, his armor worn with centuries of battle. His presence alone carried the weight of 1,000 victories, an unbroken record of dominance in combat. He had never lost. Not once. Parker, still watching from the balcony, clenched his fists. "She's running on fumes," he muttered. "She barely made it through Silvara." Kaelin heard none of it. Her body ached, and her breath came ragged. But there was something beneath the exhaustion, something stronger than pain, stronger than fear. She had spent her life proving herself, fighting against the expectations, the whispers, the scorn, and now, with the eyes of the Empire upon her, she would not back down. The arena fell silent as Kaeldrak slowly unsheathed his weapon, a massive war blade, humming with crackling quantum energy. The weapon weighed more than an average warrior, yet he wielded it effortlessly. Kaelin, still breathless from her last battle, tightened her fists. The starting chime echoed through the arena. Kaeldrak moved first. It was like facing a force of nature. His speed defied his size. His strikes carried the full weight of centuries of fight. Kaelin dodged, barely avoiding the first swing. The ground where she had been standing cracked apart, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. The crowd gasped. Parker's voice crackled in her earpiece. She had to get through it to survive. Kaelin already knew that. She couldn't match his strength, so she wouldn't try. Kaeldrak acted. Kaelin sidestepped at the last second, twisting inside his guard, her footwork swift, precise, unpredictable. She aimed for a nerve cluster near his shoulder joint, a strike designed to weaken his. Kaeldrak didn't stop. He pressed forward, a relentless force, his strikes coming faster, stronger, merciless. Kaelin dodged, ducked, rolled, her mind racing. She was losing. She needed a new plan. Her neural tendrils flared, scanning him, watching the way he moved. Then she saw it. A pattern. Kaeldrak fought with perfect form, perfect structure, the same structure he had used for centuries. Predictable. Kaelin let him corner her, She let him see her weakness. And when he went for the final strike, she moved. She ducked under his swing, spun inside his range, and with every ounce of energy left in her body, she drove her elbow into the base of his spine. The shock of the impact sent a ripple through his neural system. Kaeldrak staggered. The first time he had faltered. The crowd froze. Parker's voice exploded in her earpiece. Now! Kaelin! Finish it! Kaelin didn't hesitate. She planted her foot, and with a surge of power fueled not by strength, but by pure will, she drove the energy field straight into his own chest plate. A burst of light erupted as the weapon overloaded, sending Kaeldrak crashing to the ground. For the first time in his legendary career, he did not rise. Then the announcer's voice cracked with disbelief. Winner, Princess Kaelin Vor'Xan. The arena erupted. The crowd roared, cheered, screamed. Ken Hanted her name. Kaelin, still gasping, looked up at the royal balcony. Her father was standing. For the second time that night, Emperor Thalzan raised his neural tendrils in the warrior's salute. Parker, watching from above, let out a slow breath. Then he smirked. Knew you had it in you, princess. Later, when the celebrations began, when nobles and warriors alike whispered of the new legend written that night, Kaelin found Parker waiting for her on the palace balcony. She stepped beside him, looking out at the lights of Vor'Xan Prime. So, she murmured, voice still hoarse from battle. I guess I'm officially the most dangerous princess in the Empire now. Parker grinned. No arguments here. Then he pulled out a small device and held it up. Kaelin frowned. What's that? Parker tapped the screen. A holographic image appeared, her standing over Kaeldrak's fallen body, fists raised, looking every bit the victorious warrior. Kaelin's neural tendrils twitched. You took a picture?